Hello, we are going to talk about quadratic equations. This is a quadratic equation. A quadratic equation is a type of equation that has an x squared in it. It can also have just x, and it can have just numbers. So let's look at a few more examples. Now, the second equation is x squared plus 2. That's a quadratic equation because there is an x squared. It does not have a term in x. That is alright. As long as there is an x squared in the equation, it's called a quadratic equation. That equation, 3x plus 4, is not a quadratic equation because it does not have an x squared. So we cross that out. This equation, 2x squared equals to 0, that is a quadratic equation because it has an x squared. So even though it does not have an x term, or it does not have a number like that or that in the previous equation, it is still a quadratic equation. So it is common to write an equation in this format. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals to 0. What this means is that a, b, and c represents numbers that we actually know. Numbers that we know. Like the 2, the minus 3, and the 1. X itself is the unknown, like the x there in the first equation. So x is a symbol that we don't know, but the a, b, and c represents numbers that we know. So for example, in the first equation there, 2 would be the a, b would be the minus 3, and 1 would be the c. How about the second equation? Now in x squared plus 2, alright, what would a be? So we have ax squared here in this, and we have just x squared there. If it's just x squared, it really means 1x squared. So the a is 1 in this equation. Now there is no term in x. So that just means that the b x in this equation, that the b is 0, because 0b is 0. That's why there's no x. And then c would be the 2. So in this way, we can think of this as a formula or a format for the quadratic equation, for this type of equations. So in the third equation, in 2x squared equals to 0, a would be the 2, Now there is no other terms. There is no x, there is no number like c. So this means that the b and the c are both 0 in this equation. Alright, so let's continue. Let's take a look at the type of quadratic equation where the b is 0. If the b is 0, we are left with ax squared plus c. So let's look at this type of equation where we have x squared and just the a and the c. So for example, it could look like that. That's an example where the a is 1. So 1 is just 1x squared, which is x squared. And c is minus 9 in this example. So if we have this equation, we can try and find the answer. Let's try. Minus 9, we can move over to the right side. Just add 9 to both sides. So 9 is gone from there. Minus 9 plus 9 is 0. 0 plus 9 here is 9. So we have changed it to x squared plus 9. Now, then to find x can be 3, because we know that 3 squared is 9, or we say because 3 is the square root of 9, right? When we go from change from x squared to x, it's the same as taking the square root. If you take the square root of x squared, we get x. So if we do take the square root on the left hand side, we should also take the square root on the right hand side. So if you think of it this way, I can write x as square root of 9, which is 3. But there is another solution. The other solution is minus 3. You see, if x is minus 3, then x squared is minus 3 times minus 3. And the minus sign will cancel so that we still get 9. Right? So whether it's 3 times 3 or minus 3 times minus 3, we will still get 9. This means that there are 2 possible answers in this equation. X can be plus 3 or minus 3. So what we see here is something that happens quite often for quadratic equations. Previously, we have looked at equations without the x squared, and when we solve it, we just get one answer. So those equations that have just x are simpler. They're called linear equation. In this case, with quadratic equations, equation with x squared, we would often get 2 answers. So both of these are answers because when we put the number, substitute the number back into the original equation, this or this, it is correct. If I put 3 into here, the left hand side is equal to the right hand side. If I put minus 3 into here, the left hand side is again equal to the right hand side. That's why there are two possible answers. Now, a simple way, in this case, if the answer can be 3 or minus 3, there is a way to write them together. We can either just write 3 or minus 3, or we can write x is equal to plus minus 3, like that. We can use this symbol with a plus sign and a minus sign below. So when we say plus minus 3, it means the same as saying 3 or minus 3. We'll now look at a more complicated example of quadratic equations. But before that, we need to do a little exercise to get used to an idea. Look at this multiplication, 3 times 0. We know that any number times 0 is 0. So therefore, 3 times 0 is 0. Let's try another one. 0 times 2. So 0 times any number is also 0. 0 times 2 is 0. Okay, that's simple enough. And we also know that 0 times 0 is 0. So first, we want to be familiar with this idea, this fact. Then let's do something with algebra. Let's apply this idea to algebra. Suppose, let's say, I have two symbols. I multiply A by B. And I'm told that the answer is 0. So I have these two numbers, A and B. I don't know what they are, but I know that when you multiply them, you should get 0. So what does this tell us about A and B? From our exercise just now, we know that any number times 0 is 0. Now look at it another way. When you multiply two numbers, if the answer is 0, then one of that number has to be 0. That means you cannot multiply two numbers that are not 0 and get 0. For example, I cannot do 2 times 3 to get 0. That's wrong. That's not possible. So when I multiply two numbers, if the answer is 0, then one of the numbers must be 0. So if I multiply a by b and get 0, either a must be 0 or b must be 0, or they can both be 0. So let me write down this. This means that ab equals to 0 means a equals to 0 or b equals to 0 or both. So this is the idea that we want to be familiar with in algebra for the next type of equations we are going to try. Look at this equation. There are two brackets multiplied together. Okay, each bracket contains an expression in x. And this equation tells us that when you multiply the two brackets together, you get 0. Now remember, you can think of each bracket as a number. After all, if you look at this x plus 1 in the first bracket, we don't know x, but we know that x represents a number. So if you have here a number plus 1, which is just a number, so that means that this bracket is really a number. So x minus 3 in the same way is another number. So bracket times bracket really means number times number. So when you have this number times this number, this bracket times this bracket, you get 0. From what we have learned just now, it means that one of the brackets must be 0 or both. So it means that either x plus 1 must be 0 or x minus 3 must be 0. So when we write this down, what we really get now are two equations. If you look at each one, if you look at this one, x plus 1 equal to 0, this is an equation that we can solve. We can calculate x from this equation. Let's do that. If x plus 1 is 0, to find x, I want to get rid of the 1, so I subtract 1 from both sides. On the left side, 1 subtract 1 is nothing. Sorry, on the left side, when I subtract 1, I just have x remain. On the right side, when I subtract 1, I get minus 1. So we have an answer now. X can be minus 1. Let's go on to the next equation. X minus 3 equal to 0. It's a different equation, and we can again solve for the x. Let's do that. Now we have on the left side x minus 3. To find x, we need to get rid of the minus 3, and we can do that if we add 3 to both sides. So if I add 3 to the left side, minus 3 plus 3 gives 0. Add 3 to the right side, I get 3. So now the answer is x equals to 3. I have two answers now. I have x minus 1, x can be minus 1, or x can be 3. So let's try and make some sense of this. We have two possible answers. We can check that they are the right answers by substituting them back into the original equation. So if I substitute x equals to minus 1 into this equation, what do I get? I will get on the left hand side, we have these two brackets. If I substitute x equal to minus 1 in there, I get minus 1 plus 1. Minus 1 in there, I get minus 1 minus 3. So minus 1 plus 1 is 0. Minus 1 minus 3 is minus 4. The two brackets should be multiplied together. So I have 0 times minus 4, which is 0. And which is the same as the right hand side. So we can see that x equal to minus 1 is a correct answer, because when we substitute into the x, you find that one of the brackets, in this case we get minus 1 plus 1 like this, becomes 0, and 0 times any number, whatever the number in the other bracket is, 0 multiplied by that must give 0. In the same way, you'll find that if you substitute x equal to 3, the other answer, into this equation, you will get on this bracket 3 minus 3, which is 0. Then 0 times any number in this bracket will give 0. So therefore, x equals to 3 is also a correct answer. That means that both minus 1, x equal to minus 1, and x equal to 3 are correct. Now let's just be a little bit careful about this. We are saying that the answer can be minus 1. We are saying that the answer for x can be minus 1, or it can be 3. We are saying that there are two possible answers. What we are not saying is that x can be minus 1 and 3 at the same time. We are not saying that, because minus 1 is not the same as 3. Minus 1 is not equal to 3. Right? So it's just that x can be minus 1 or minus 3. That they are both possible answers, but we are not saying that x is equal to these two numbers at the same time. Let's look at a slightly more difficult example. X squared minus x minus 2 equals to 0. So that's a quadratic equation, and we want to find x. Now the way to do this equation is to factorize it. Now if you remember, we have looked at factorization previously, and the way to do it, in this case, when we have just x squared with no number in front of it, the way to do it is to write down two brackets. Put an x in each bracket. Put a blank on the other side. So each bracket should have two terms. It should have x, and there should be a number. We don't know the number yet. We are just putting a blank here. We are just preparing a space for it, and we are going to try and find this number. And it's the same for the other bracket. Alright, each bracket is x plus a number. So how do we find this number? Remember that the product of the two numbers in the two blanks, should be equal to the number in the quadratic equation. Now I'm going to introduce a new name. I'm going to call this the constant term. Alright, that's the term in x squared, term in x, and the number is called the constant term, in the sense that we know what the number is, so it's fixed. It's not an unknown. So it doesn't change either. Right, so these two numbers will multiply to give minus 2. And the way to find this number is to think about the factors of minus 2. So let's write this down. What are the possible factors of minus 2? We know the factors of 2 can be 1 times 2. And since there's a minus sign, let me put a minus sign there. So I can have minus 1 times 2. Now the other possible case is is 1 times minus 2.